And Marlis, I'm going to have you actually pull the PowerPoint back up for just a second.
I'm going to go sit over here so I can see better.
So what you are seeing is a bit of a conundrum, because would be the first to actually tell you that I tend not to be quite so literal in how I understand Torah. And yet, as I was preparing to speak words of Torah on this week's Torah portion on Vayechi, I knew I was going to be talking about Joseph's bones. The bones of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who goes down to Egypt and goes from a slave to the head of a household, and from the head of the household to prison, and then from prison to second in command of all of Egypt, rescuing his families, all of that. In this week's Torah portion, we're actually at the very end of Genesis, and Jacob dies and is buried, or actually is then taken back up to the Hebron, to the cave of the patriarchs, and buried. But at the very end of Genesis, what do we hear? We hear of the death of Joseph, and that he is embalmed, and his bones stay in the land of Egypt. But he says to his children before he dies, when you leave Egypt, make sure you take my bones with me. And so we actually then get in Exodus where Moses takes the bones of Joseph as they flee at night. And it's a little early to start preparing for Passover, but I'm guessing that all of you have heard the Passover story once or twice. In that sequence of departing from Egypt, Moses takes Joseph's bones and they take them back up with them on their journey. In fact, one commentary points out that what were the two things that the people of Israel had with them? One was an ark that had the Ten Commandments, and the other was a vessel that had the bones of Joseph. That's how significant this value of the bones of Joseph are. And so one of the pieces that I share with you tonight is this idea of what does it mean for us to think about Joseph's bones. Because that's where I started to get to the figurative part, to not worry so much about the literal part, because the bones of Joseph aren't just, we've got to bury Joseph. What else has embodied that? All of that sense of connection that he had to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, but also all of that value and future that they wanted their values, their connection, their whole covenant to go on, to be carried on into future generations. And the way I explain it to you is this. It's very simple. As I start asking you to think about what your bones are and whose bones you have to carry. Because obviously, yes, there's uvayat hamet, escorting the dead. There is incredible amount of mitzvah and responsibility when someone you love dies, escorting them to the grave. In fact, in my thesis, which was on the cemeteries of Mississippi and Louisiana, Jewish cemeteries, very often the community actually came into existence because someone dies, and in Jewish life, you have to have a Jewish cemetery, so a group of Jews would come together. They would have to form some type of organization. They'd then buy the land and start the cemetery, and in the process, start the synagogue. It happened in a number of places that I researched in Mississippi and Louisiana. It's such a central part. But when I ask that question of what are our bones that we will want carried into the future, what are the bones that we have to care for, I ask you to think a little more figuratively. I'll come back to the literal in a moment. Because how many of us just bury a loved one and then you walk away? Is that the Jewish way? No. Cantor says quite passionately no. So you want to make sure you can get back to where they're buried. Judy is already shaking her head, and Mazel Tov, Judy, on the new great-granddaughter. we have some kvelling going on in the sanctuary. What do we do in Judaism after a loved one dies? You sit Shiva, right? You sit around for 7 days. You eat until your gills are stuffed, share stories, share tears, say the Kaddish, and after Shiva's done, is Shloshim. We still then move out into the community, but we still sang Kaddish, turning memory into a blessing. How do we honor someone? How do we feel their presence? Feel the ways that they've shaped us. It goes on until unveiling, until a year of Kaddish comes to an end. And then, for good measure, not only do we have Yartzeit, but we also have Yizkor. In Judaism, we are always carrying the bones. We are always finding ways to honor and to remember, to cry, to laugh. And I extend that because I'm not just talking about that sharing of memory, because what also goes with Joseph as they are carrying those bones when they go, what is also embodied in that? All of his skills, all of the things he was passionate about, all of the values he held dear, that is how we honor and remember that we look in for our loved ones in ourselves, or we look for our loved ones in the others that come after. As Ashkenazim, what do? We name our children and grandchildren after our loved ones who have come before. There are so many ways that it's embedded in our tradition that as we read this story, it's great. We have this incredible story of finding Joseph's bones, but I think it's easy for us to say, that's just the story, and not ask ourselves that question of what are the bones that we have? What are we going to leave behind? And whose bones, what are we doing to carry for the bones of our loved one? Now, I told you I had a literal and a figurative problem going on. I've given you all of this figurative language as I talk about Joseph's bones, and I call your attention to what's on the screen. I often talk about Ike Eisenstein. Ike and Eliza, they are absolutely amazing. We're amazing human beings. They were members of our congregation for many years. And Ike's last lesson to me, when I visited him in the hospital just before he died, he taught me this whole lesson about smiling. And it was in the midst of preparing for this, and I didn't even make the name connection when I first realized this. I said, wait a second. I had the same experience with Richard Bialowski's father. I remember, and Richard and I have talked about this, I went and I visited Richard and Jane. I hadn't really known them for very long, right? They had come up because Richard's father was very sick, end of his life. Rabbi Bernholz, can you come and visit? So I went and I was visiting with them. And as I am sitting there, this is what Richard's father wrote. And I can read it because it's hard in here for you to see. My kids are the best in the world, he wrote. God did not choose the Jews. God gave the Jews the choice, and most of them, underlining, most of them accepted. And he said, and Richard says, these are the last words he really said. The most important thing in the world is love. Which was something I really needed to remember this week as I watch our world really trying to do its best to tear itself apart. And I kept thinking, Ike said to smile, Richard's dad said to love. And then it hit me earlier this afternoon. What was Richard's father's name? Anybody want to take a guess? No guesses? Joseph. Quite literally, what you're seeing here are Joseph's bones. The values, with his last of his ruach and koach, the last of his spirit and strength, he shared what was important to him. He shared it with me. He shared it with Richard. He found a way of leaving a mark quite literally in this world and then passed it on to Richard and Jane, to me, to give us opportunities every time we tell that story to go and find the bones of Joseph, to bring them forward and to carry them to connect across time and space, to honor and remember the past, but also think about how do we take all of that and carry it forward into our future. It is a tremendous challenge. One last piece that I can offer for you. Because all of us have loved ones that we have said goodbye to in all sorts of different ways, and not all of us have a piece of paper like this. Not all of us get a chance in a moment. There are all kinds of ways that we can carry our loved ones, both physically and spiritually, in memory and in action, into our world. But there is another element that I share with you, an element that is really incredible part of the story. Moses did not know where Joseph's bones were. They were actually hidden. There is midrash that, in fact, the Egyptians hid Joseph's bones. So there's two. One, that they hid Joseph's bones because if the people of Israel couldn't find the bones, they wouldn't go up out of the land of Egypt. And the other, they said, is that Joseph was such a source of blessing, they put Joseph's bones into the Nile River so that the Nile would always be blessed by Joseph's memory. Seen both of those commentaries. But how did Moses find Joseph in order to carry him forward into their past, into their future? Because there was a bridge of generations. How many years from Joseph to Moses? 400. That's a long space of time to carry memory. And yet, there was an incredible individual. At the end of Genesis, there's a list of the 70 who go down with Joseph. One of the only woman on the list, her name is Sarah bat Asher. In the list in Numbers, where it talks about the families that come up out of Egypt and go off into the wilderness, there's a name, one name, that gets repeated. Sarah bat Asher. One woman, a name appears, that's it, the only mentions in Torah of Sarah bat Asher, but the only name that's on both lists, the only woman on the list that is in Genesis. How incredible, how remarkable. And the rabbis say, why is she there? Why is she significant? And the answer is, she's the bridge across the generations. She is alive in the time of Joseph, and she is alive in the time of Moses. And what do we say in terms of values in Judaism? Dor vador, generation to generation. It is up to one generation to tell the next, to tell the next, to be those bridges, sharing with each other our values, our vision, our hopes, our dreams, and finding ways of taking that stuff, those grand thoughts that are in our head, finding ways of turning them into the action of making our world a place of shalom. It is my hope, it is my prayer that each of us finds ways to think about what we want to leave behind in this world, and that we find those opportunities with our loved ones, with our friends, with those who cross our paths, to be ready to carry that from them into the future. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.